Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Julie Satow, the author of The Plaza, The Secret Life of America's Most Famous Hotel. This is her first book, and she is a real estate reporter for the New York Times. Her work has appeared, of course, in a host of other places. So first of all, thanks so much for being here, Julie.
Oh, thanks for having me, Evan.
Yeah, this is going to be a really fun discussion. I haven't done one yet about a building, so this is a first.
Okay.
The Plaza, just saying it brings to mind all kinds of things. Luxury, Central Park, the beautiful building, Fifth Avenue, the best public bathrooms, of course. And you mentioned that in the book. You think of Home Alone 2. You think of the 45th president. You think of the beautiful carpeting, the buzz of activity in the front, the ring of lights near the top. And I thought of, when I saw the book title, I thought of Elaine Bennis in Seinfeld saying, after getting a free room there, she goes, "It's the Plaza." So why do we need a book about a building, Julie?
Yeah, I mean, we need books about buildings. It depends what kind of buildings, I will say. I feel like a hotel is its own kind of a unique sort of building because yes, it is a physical structure and not a person. So it's strange to have a biography about a physical thing like a building, but a hotel is so unique because it's a place where people come and go, where people stay sometimes for months or weeks or days. It's populated with characters. A building like the Plaza is so amazing because it's been around for so long. I mean, it opened in 1907, so it's seen such a it's seen so much over more than 10 decades, right? So I felt like this book needed to be told because it's such an eyewitness, a sort of social eyewitness to the social history of Manhattan and New York, and yeah.
And one of the great things about hotels in general, but especially the Plaza, is that you can just walk into it, and it's got this big name. But I mean, my grandmother and I would go to FAO Schwartz when that was still open years ago. I'm from New York, and we'd go in there, and then we'd go into the public bathrooms that were there, and it was like you can just walk in, and that's, I guess, what makes it full of content for a reporter to talk about.
Right. So exactly. Well, first of all, I knew you were from New York because you knew about the bathrooms. That was definitely like a New York City kind of open secret that people who lived here knew. If you were shopping in Midtown and you needed a nice bathroom, you always went to the Plaza. And it's totally true that it is it's very exclusive. It's very wealthy and elite, and, all these famous people are there, but anyone can walk in and anyone can sit down in the lobby and listen to music wafting from the palm court and enjoy the ambiance. It is a public institution in many ways. So, I
want to just ask, and this is far afield here, but, and you don't even, I don't know if you address this in the book. Are the people who own the Plaza, are they okay with it being used as a public bathroom?
Well, I should say, okay, so the Plaza of today is very different than the Plaza that we knew growing up in New York City. So I would say the Plaza that we all remember, those of us who might remember from the 80s or the 70s or the 60s or even the 50s or 40s, yes, it was seen as really, like I said, a public institution that, they knew people went in and used the bathrooms. You don't think the concierge behind the desk saw what was going on? Sure. Today, it's a somewhat different animal because the building is mostly condominium. And while there is a small boutique hotel still there, it is sort of siphoned off to the side, and you're actually not allowed in unless you are a hotel guest. So there are other areas of the building that are open to you, but it doesn't have that same kind of welcoming vibe that maybe you're talking about.
All right. Well, we're going to get to some of that. We're going to trace a little bit of the history here. Your book begins in 1907 at the Plaza, and that's when this Plaza opened its doors. And I had no idea about this. There was actually a first Plaza
Mm-hmm.
What it's New York has this history of this. It reminds me of like Madison Square Garden, where there's been like 3 or 4 Madison Square Gardens. What happened to the first plaza, and why did the one we know today get built?
Yeah, so it originally, that spot at the corner of 59th and Fifth Avenue at the sort of bottom of Central Park, that was actually a skating pond. And it was like wealthy New Yorkers would go there to skate in the winters. And then it was made into, as you said, on top of this pond was basically built the first plaza, which was a kind of smaller structure. It was only about 8 stories. It was built, it was glamorous and considered like a big deal when it first opened. But only a few years after it opened, actually, the Waldorf Astoria opened, the original Waldorf Astoria, and that immediately became, the place to go and the most famous hotel in New York. So the first plaza kind of lost some of its luster, and it didn't. It at the time, which was like in the 1890s, a lot of buildings were starting to be built very tall. They had these sort of steel skeletons that allowed for skyscrapers had been invented. So people were starting to build much taller. And this plaza did not have it. It was sort of, a squat brick building, 8 stories, kind of traditional. So it just was sort of out of favor. So these guys, two guys bought it, and they decided to tear it down and build, the building we all know today. So.
And so were they trying to one up the Waldorf Astoria? Was this like a spite type thing?
Yes, absolutely. They decided, like, we're going to do the Waldorf Astoria, but better. So they actually hired the same architect who did the original Waldorf Astoria. His name was Henry Janeway Hardenberg. They hired him, and he designed the plaza. The original Waldorf was very, like, detailed, and there were lots of filigrees and fancy kind of, it was very ornate. And the plaza that we know is very simple. It's made of white, sort of terracotta brick, and it has kind of this very clean facade.
Clean.
And yeah, so he meant it sort of like the Waldorf was kind of his practice, and then the plaza was his masterpiece. And yeah, the idea was that this would be better than the plaza, and it was. They hired away a bunch of people who worked at the Waldorf to come work at the plaza, and it was kind of this big competition between the 2 hotels.
So in 1907, and I got excited as I was reading this. It was like really, it was like a festival. It was like really exciting. In 1907, there's this hive of activity as the new plaza is opening, and someone with one of the most famous names in American history, Vanderbilt, you write, strides into the hotel, past these onlookers, and then signs his name to become the first guest.
Yeah.
You say, though, that nothing at the plaza is as it first appeared. So can you describe that day and the feelings that New Yorkers had as this new hotel opened?
Yeah. So it was really this excitement, it was kind of like, here's this amazing hotel, and there was all this, build up and marketing push for this hotel, the new, the better Waldorf Astoria. And so they asked Vanderbilt they said, look, we want you to be our first ever guest. Okay. Because obviously you're Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt. You're this dashing millionaire, and you're such a famous, wealthy New Yorker. This is really the way we want to start off. So they asked him to be the first guest, and it was all sort of a marketing ploy. It seemed very natural. They had called all the journalists, though, the day before and said, come in front of the plaza at 9 a.m. You need to wait in front, and you're going to see all these stars. So, of course, all these reporters showed up, and, Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt marched into the hotel, and he signed the registry as the first ever guest, as you say, and, all these other famous New Yorkers and movie stars and all kinds of personalities, followed him afterwards, and it really kind of set the stage for what the plaza would be like. It felt organic, but it was not. It was very planned. And yeah, I also say that at that first day, they introduced the first ever New York City taxi cabs in front of the plaza. So that was also part of this marketing. We're going to have taxis, these new motorized taxis, instead of, horse-drawn hansom cabs, which is what most people think of, what most people used to take around at the time. So,
and that's the one, I think you wrote that is the one place you can still find the horse-drawn carriages. I think
exactly. I always find that ironic,
Yeah, so what does the plaza represent about America in the early 1900s? And, this is the progressive era, and Teddy Roosevelt is president, and America is asserting itself on the world stage. And there are all these questions about what laws should there be to protect people. So one of the things that you say is that it wasn't just society's chief gathering spot, it's the foundation of a powerful real estate empire, the likes of which had never been seen. So how does that fit in with what's happening in America in the early
Right.
1900s?
Totally. So you're right. The reason why I love this topic, using the plaza is because it's like this perfect lens through which to see these greater trends going on in the country at the time. So the man who actually built the plaza, he had a partner as well. It was two guys, but the main guy is this guy, Harry Black, who he basically was the original Donald Trump. He was like the first ever real estate tycoon. And he also built like the Flatiron Building on 23rd Street, Macy's Herald Square. He did all of these major buildings, and he also built the plaza. And he kind of created this real estate empire, and he was this really flashy character. He lived in the penthouse on the top floor of the hotel, and he was kind of this larger than life guy, and he really kind of symbolized this robber baron, Gilded Age kind of era and what was happening in real estate. He also, in the 1910s, and as things went on in the early 1920s, he got really into stocks. He became this like huge stock proponent of stocks, and he tried to like sell stocks in order to fund his real estate projects, which was a totally novel thing to do. So he was kind of symbolic of this kind of big business and what was going on at the time in terms of the market and New York, and wealth.
One of the reasons I love your book is that you talk about people like that, but the plaza is not only about rich people, but it's also about people who are working class, and who are living, lives frankly, like most of us do. And one of the great things about it, the plaza, is that, it's this kind of clash of civilizations. And there's a labor dispute that you write about where the workers that make the plaza go essentially say, do you really expect us to survive on tips alone? And that's a very progressive era type thing to have happen. They start to band together with workers at other hotels, and they actually walk off the job as dinner is being served. So describe this dispute that comes up and how this relates to what is everyday life here.
Totally. So, a lot of your listeners might be familiar with like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. This was a time when organized labor was just kind of starting to organize. People were realizing that unions were important, and they were starting to make more of an effort. And so, of course, this also happened at the plaza. And these waiters and the staff were not treated very well. As you say, they were basically paid tips. They were, penalized if they did things like laugh when they were not supposed to, or have dirty fingernails. They had to their pay was cut. So it was a very a lot of unfair treatment towards them. So they organized, and all the hotel workers and restaurant workers in the city, basically a majority of them, decided to organize and walk off the job. They left a bunch of plaza diners, just kind of sitting there with their plates at 7 p.m. in the middle of dinner hour. And it was a brutal fight. The hotel owners, including at the plaza, did not want to give in. And eventually it was sort of a kind of a draw what happened. They did get some benefit, some changes, but the union was not recognized. The hotel union, it wasn't recognized for another, I think, 20 years or something.
And what happens to the workers? Do they just go back to work?
Well, it was tough because what happened was the plaza, the manager of the plaza was very smart. He was this guy who was sort of had a lot of experience with hotels, and he had an idea that this may be happening, that his workers were possibly going to strike. So he had actually called down to these hotels down south. At the time, it was kind of the low season in the south. And so all these hotel workers who typically worked in the south, and most of them were African American, And the Plaza, typically, like a lot of hotels in New York, had mostly white workers at the time, from Europe, Irish, Italian immigrants. This manager called down, and he brought all these African American hotel workers who were out of work at the time down south up to the Plaza, and he put them up in the rooms. And when the waiters struck and they left, he brought all these these strike breakers down, essentially, and had them work.
Wow.
And it created, as you can imagine, a lot of tension. But eventually, what happened was the striking workers did not have any funds. They weren't getting paid, so they couldn't really keep the strike up, and they needed their jobs back. And the Plaza said, sorry guys, we'll keep the African American workers from down south if you guys want to stay. But most of them did not want to stay and went back to the south, and they rehired a lot of the workers.
Boy, what a sort of collision of all kinds of things,
right?
In that, so many forces. So let's transition then to the 30s and 40s. There's a change in ownership at the Plaza. World War II starts. There are major changes to the economy, and it's now survived the Great Depression. Does the tone at the Plaza ever change? Do things become less luxurious, let's say?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Yeah, definitely. All of a sudden, you have all the, the war effort. So you've got people coming to and from the war front, a lot of them staying at the Plaza. There was actually a dearth of rooms, of places for the soldiers to stay while they were waiting for ships to take them to the war front. So the Plaza, along with a lot of hotels, actually opened up their rooms to the soldiers. I even heard one anecdote where they took the ballroom at the Plaza and they put hundreds of cots in there so the soldiers could have places to stay, and they limited the amount of time that regular hotel guests could stay to only a few nights. So there were a lot of things like that. There was also, the Plaza kind of became, you think of, a lot of nightclubs in the 40s and the 30s. They had a really famous nightclub called the Persian Room, where they had a lot of singers, and the soldiers would come and stay. And then also you saw more women going into the workforce at the time, because a lot of men were off fighting the war. So you had women in the workforce, and that also happened at the Plaza, where you had a woman manager all of a sudden, where you had women doing jobs like being the bellhop at the Plaza, things like that would have never normally been the case.
So many things. The Plaza is this sort of vehicle for so many social changes, and you would never think of it. I certainly wouldn't have thought of that, but it's no doubt true. How does the Plaza then transition out of this difficult period in American history?
Yeah, then, sort of the 50s come after the war. And that's a very different kind of, the 30s, obviously, we didn't mention, but, the Depression was very tough going for the Plaza. Most people wanted to go to like speakeasies where they could drink alcohol, like the 21 Club or something. And a place like the Plaza where you couldn't have alcohol was not exactly popular. So that was really tough. Then you had the war effort. So as you said, it was the 30s and 40s were not easy for the Plaza. But then the 50s came, and a very important guest wrote a book that became a very big
I was going to ask you about her, but go ahead.
So that's really that kind of defined the 50s, I would say, in the Plaza.
And so the name is Eloise.
Yes.
So let's talk about who Eloise is and who is she and whose mind she came out of.
Yes. So Kay Thompson was this like amazing character. She had wanted to be like a film actress, but she wasn't very beautiful, and she never really made it in Hollywood. But she was an amazing singer. So she started this cabaret act, and she performed with like the Williams brothers, which was like a really big deal at the time. And she was this cabaret singer, and she would perform at the Plaza a lot, at the Persian Room. And sort of as part of her act, she kind of had this little child, this little girl character that she would do, that she called Eloise. It was kind of her, her alter ego, and it was kind of this bratty 6-year-old. And a friend basically convinced her that it really should be a book, and she introduced her to this young artist. His name was Hilary Knight, in the city, and the two of them basically got down to business, and they crafted what we know as the Eloise books. And it was basically, this 6-year-old girl who lives at the Plaza and who misbehaves and causes all kinds of chaos at the snooty hotel. And it was a huge success.
And who would have ever thought that would have been the precursor to a movie that we'll talk about later? In a certain
right, exactly.
The 50s and 60s, there's also this incredible parade of guests who are staying there. Capote, Sinatra, the Beatles. Why do they all stay there, and what does the Plaza start to symbolize about celebrity culture? And what is the mood as these incredible stars come in?
Yeah. So exactly, like it sort of becomes this, the place to be. When Truman Capote wrote this, In Cold Blood, this huge bestseller, and he wanted to celebrate and essentially throw himself a party, he was like, the only place I would ever throw myself a party was the Plaza, in the Plaza Ballroom. That was considered the ultimate, in glamour and, beauty. And so, he threw himself the black and white ball, where people like Sinatra, as you say, and any star you can essentially think of, basically came to this party. It was this huge, it was the most coveted guest list in the history of parties, and it was this massive party. And then that really helped put the Plaza on the map. And of course, when the Beatles decided that they were going to come to America for their first U.S. tour,
now that's a big day. That's a big day when you're hosting.
Yes. They also stayed at the Plaza. And, I say in my book, I found out that whole thing, almost never happened. They didn't realize when they booked their reservation at the Plaza, the Beatles weren't yet famous in America. They were kind of a big deal in England, but they hadn't had like a Billboard top 10 hit yet here. And so the Plaza reservationists just basically thought it was like 4 businessmen from England coming. And it wasn't until like about 2 weeks before the Beatles arrived that someone told the manager, like, hey, do you realize that the Beatles are coming? This is going to be insane. So he actually went to cancel the reservation, because he felt like, their vibe did not exactly match the kind of rarefied atmosphere of the hotel. And but he had this like 12-year-old daughter who completely freaked out and lost her mind that her dad was going to cancel on the Beatles. So essentially that's why the Beatles ended up staying.
Don't you cancel that reservation?
Exactly. He was a good dad. Yeah.
Were there a lot of people at the hotel that day waiting to see them come in?
Oh my, it was insane. I mean, for like days before, there were people trying to sneak in and camp out in the Plaza stairwell, and throughout the Beatles stay, the girls would hide in boxes and, have their friends bring them up to the concierge and say, hey, we have a delivery for the Beatles, and of course the doormen had been, taught not to believe any of that. So they would, say sorry, and out would pop 2 crumpled girls, hoping to get up to the Beatles hotel room. So it was, and it was mayhem in front of the hotel, just thousands of fans parked there. So,
and they weren't overly impressed, were they? The Beatles, or I don't know if impressed, but they weren't taken by it.
No, they were actually like super polite, very well behaved. Supposedly, they asked for lots of tea to be delivered to their rooms, but they did not create any, didn't cause a fuss. It was really the fans who were the chaotic things, not the Beatles themselves. So
Interesting. The 70s then bring economic ruin again. The Plaza then has to endure a very difficult time period. New York goes through an awful time where, it headlines all over the country about how badly New York was doing. There's the famous Daily News headline, Ford to City drop dead. What is happening at the Plaza? And you write about a very big pile of garbage that piles up there. Talk about that.
I mean, it's the Plaza endured the Great Depression, and this was probably the next time that it was really kind of in the doldrums. I mean, the city, as you said, was like on the brink of bankruptcy. There were like all these sanitation strikes, so people the garbage men weren't working. So yeah, there were huge piles of garbage. I found these pictures from Newsweek. They were like 7 feet high in the air, like lined up along 58th Street, just along the Plaza, because there was no place for all this garbage to go. There was a citywide blackout, and the Plaza obviously, was part of that, suffered from that. It was, there were a lot of crime. So there was a lot of prostitution happening at the Oak Bar restaurant at the Plaza. There were tons of prostitutes, a lot of petty theft at the hotel. Things were tough, for sure.
Yeah. And does the Plaza make headlines because of it? Or is this does it blend in with the rest of the misery in New York?
No, for sure. I mean, there was like definitely some famous, there was a crazy jewel heist there where all of these armed gunmen came in at about 4 a.m. and held everyone hostage who was working at the hotel and took all this jewelry from all the safe deposit box of the hotel. There was a German ambassador who was staying at the hotel who supposedly was standing outside smoking a cigarette when he was thoroughly harassed by these prostitutes and was arrested for engaging with the prostitutes. So I don't know, but there was all sorts of things like that. I mean, there was a lot of, those were the kind of, headlines. And I would also say that the hotel itself really struggled. We talked about Kate Thompson, who wrote the Eloise books. So she actually, the hotel was so excited by all this free marketing from her books that they let her live at the hotel basically just for free for decades. And in the 70s, the hotel was just in so much financial trouble that they actually evicted her they said you either have to pay or we're evicting you. And they ended up evicting her, and they gave her only 24 hours to leave her room. So pretty good.
So during this whole thing, there's a certain someone keeping an eye on this hotel. He's got an eye on it. He sees he has a good view of it. And the 80s hit, and he's trying to make a name for himself. And this guy who gets even more famous as the year goes on, and then really, really famous and really, really powerful, says, I've got to have this hotel. Why does Donald Trump want this hotel so badly?
Yes, that is right. He the Plaza is the most iconic, most beautiful, some would say, building in the city. And he always loved the hotel. His, Trump Tower is just around the corner from the Plaza, and his office has this kind of, his windows look right onto the building. He has a bird's eye view of the hotel, and so did his apartment in Trump Tower. And he always kind of pined after it, seeing it as the ultimate acquisition. He called it, the Mona Lisa of buildings and a masterpiece. So when the go-go 80s hit, and Donald Trump is kind of at the height of his real estate power, he basically borrowed a huge amount of sum from all the banks, and he paid what was about $500,000 per hotel room for the building.
And explain a little bit how the deal goes down. Where does he get that money from?
Yeah. So, I mean, as he was doing in the 80s, he didn't really put any money of his own in the deal. It was all borrowed. The banks couldn't wait to lend to Donald Trump because it seemed like at the time everything he was touching was turning to a gilded brass or gold. They happily lent him all this money. And so he borrowed to buy the plaza, and then he used the plaza as an asset to borrow even more to build a bunch of casinos in Atlantic City. So the plaza had an incredible amount of debt on it when he owned it.
And we are going to get to eventually how it all falls apart. But now that we're into Donald Trump's ownership, I do have to ask about Home Alone 2. And I know I've brought this up a couple of times already. Maybe that just speaks to the time period that I grew up in. But,
exactly.
We're familiar with this movie, or at least some of us are. And Kevin McAllister, Macaulay Culkin, comes walking into the plaza, and he's looking for how to get to the front door, or I guess to the reservation table. And he says, "Stop somebody he doesn't recognize," and goes, "Which way?" And Donald Trump turns around and points. But maybe my favorite anecdote in the history of books, and that's saying something because I've read hundreds of them. The number used for reservations that Kevin gives in the movie, or I guess Kevin's calling and he hears the message, 800-759-3000. That is the real number of the plaza.
Yep, that was Donald's marketing genius. He was
so it was his idea to put that.
Yes,
in the movie?
absolutely. Use the plaza's real phone number. People will call for. The only problem was when the movie went to DVD or VHS, I guess as was the case. A lot of people kept pausing it and rewinding, so they recorded the number, and all of a sudden it was like the operators were inundated with just an insane number of crank calls asking to speak with Kevin. So
I'm sorry, there's just no better anecdote that I've ever read in a movie. Do you remember where you found that anecdote? Was it in a newspaper at the time, or it's up? If you don't have it off the top of your head, you don't have it.
I don't. Yeah.
It's all right.
I'd probably have to look at my notes.
That's fine.
I can get it to you.
We can tweet that out at some point.
Okay.
So the other thing that I learned from the book was that while some of it was clearly shot there, most of it wasn't, and there's no pool at the hotel.
No.
And people you would think there was from Home Alone.
Yes, people were so disappointed. I don't know if this made this in the book, but someone told me that they were working at the plaza at the time in guest relations, and they were in the elevator, and a family got in with goggles and their bathing suits.
That is in the book. Yeah.
And they wanted to go to the plaza pool, and she was like, "I'm so sorry, there's not really a pool here."
Oh man, if that whole story and anecdote does not encapsulate everything about Donald Trump, I don't know what does.
Right?
So then what happens? Okay, so this movie hits, and what happens under the 45th president's leadership?
Yeah, so he basically, the first thing he does is he puts his wife, who they are having marital issues, but he puts Ivana in charge of the plaza. He makes her the president. And this is, she is the first and still only woman to be the president of the plaza. And she took the job very seriously. She was no nonsense. She would stand in the mornings with binoculars, looking out her window of her apartment at Trump Tower, looking out over at the plaza, and if there was any garbage or newspapers or trash that was in front of the entrance, she would call down to the doorman and make them clean it up. I mean, she was tough. And the plaza did really well under her, actually. She made it quite glamorous. She did all these fashion shows there. She was really into fashion, so she hosted all these fashion shows at the plaza. A lot of celebrities got married there, like Murphy.
Eddie Murphy.
Yes, Eddie Murphy.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah.
Had like a really expensive, massive wedding there. It became cool. And in the 70s, the plaza was definitely not cool. And Ivana made the plaza cool. Donald and Ivana, they had their shtick, but they brought a lot of celebrity to the property. So it was actually doing quite well. under her. So,
and
but
so
there was a but there,
and
but.
so then it goes basically there's too much money that they owe on it and they can't pay it, and
So
then
basically,
yeah.
right. So so Ivana does this great job. She's managing it. I should also say, while she's managing it, they get a divorce, which is extremely messy and hugely public. So she would be, at the Oak Room, for instance, sitting at one of the tables, just crying her eyes out. And it became really awkward for all the people working at the plaza, because they essentially had two bosses. They had Ivana, who was the president, and then Donald, who was the owner, and they, hated each other and were going through this really terrible divorce. And Marla, his mistress, was basically housed in an apartment just about a block away. So she was in the mix too. So it was really confusing for all the employees.
Yeah.
Not a fun time. But eventually what happened was the plaza, even though it was doing very well and it was profitable, Donald had put an incredible amount of debt on the property, and there was just no way that it could pay down its debt service. So about 3 years after he bought it, Donald became the only person ever in the history of the plaza to bankrupt the hotel. So.
And where is it now? Not well. We know where the building is now, but what is the status of the hotel now? Just give us a brief synopsis of what happens after Donald Trump
so
gets
basically
rid of
it goes bankrupt, and the creditors sell it to some foreign owners, and it stays in foreign ownership, and it still is owned by non-Americans now. The country of Qatar are the current owners of the hotel. The hotel is currently basically boarded up and closed. So I would say we're back to a Great Depression, 1970s, and now, I would say, is basically the situation. So.
One of the great things about hotels, now that we've gotten this whole history here, one of the great things about hotels is that something really good could be going on in one room, and people doing the right thing, and people there for a business trip or whatever else. A celebration in town to see friends and family, and in the room next door, something horrible and gross can be going on, and something against the law could be going on. So just give us a brief synopsis, if you can, a brief history of the partying that's gone there and the tawdry things that have happened there and the dark side of the hotel business.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that is, you can't, you're absolutely right. It's sort of the yin and yang. I mean, think of The Great Gatsby and the famous scene where, they're drinking alcohol and partying in one of the plaza suites. So certainly, like, during the Prohibition era, there was all kinds of parties up in the rooms, even though they weren't supposed to be serving alcohol, and all kinds of things went down with that. And then through the ages, it kept going. As I mentioned, there was a lot of prostitution. There was actually so much prostitution at the hotel that it used to be on the top floors were sort of these, there were actually businesses up there and offices, and they had like chairs and couches out in the hallways, and the prostitutes knew about it. So they would go up there and kind of take a rest or a break or change their clothes and use the bathroom up there during their kind of working day. So they had to remove all the chairs from the hallways and stuff, so the prostitutes wouldn't gather there. So, all that kind of stuff was going on. Donald Trump himself was famous for having there were a lot of parties going on while he was the owner. And even though he was definitely like a teetotaler himself, there was a lot of girls, a lot of illicit drugs supposedly, and all kinds of things happening, where, he would occasionally visit. Let's see. I mean, there was, Charlie Sheen. Do we remember that? That was not that long ago. He holed himself up at the plaza when he was talking about tiger blood. The New York governor, Eliot Spitzer, had a lot of run-ins with call girls at the plaza. So all kinds of stuff like that.
And it's just one of these places, I guess, that just draws the idea of the party, but it's still a hotel, which is really interesting. So you mentioned that it's condos mostly now. What's the vision for the hotel? Where does it stand now? What's the vision?
So in like 2005, basically the city was having this huge condo boom and everyone was building condos, and the plaza, the owners decided they wanted to try to do the same thing. And the city, recognized that, hey, this is a big institution, a famous building for us. It was also like the biggest employer of, biggest hotel employer in the city. So we didn't want to lose all these hotel jobs. So there was like another big hotel union thing. And there was like a lot of actually Michael Bloomberg was the mayor at the time, and there was a lot of negotiations. And essentially what the deal was is they would keep a boutique hotel there. It's about 300 rooms, and the majority of the rooms were made into these condos. All the rooms facing Central Park and stuff are owned by very wealthy people. For instance, like the most expensive apartment is actually a $60 million one bedroom, which basically houses
one bedroom for $60 million. Come on, that's a ripoff. If it was two bedrooms,
know, right?
maybe. Two, maybe.
No, and it doesn't, no one even lives in it. It's basically like, it houses the art collection for a very famous developer. So, it's totally crazy. And it has its own entrance now for the condos, and then a separate entrance for the hotel. There is like a very popular food court down in the basement, where people can go and you can have really, you can have everything from cupcakes to sushi to, I don't know, frozen yogurt. And there's an Eloise store. So that's kind of there. And there is one restaurant open, the Palm Court. But a lot of the big famous rooms, like the Edwardian room, the Oak room, those are all closed still, unfortunately, and are just sort of not being used right now. So it's kind of a weird setup.
And I looked it up. It's like about $1,000 to stay there for a night. Do you think it'll ever be fully a hotel again?
No, sadly it can't be, because people own those condos. So
you'd have to buy them out. Yeah,
exactly. So but I do hope that it's expensive to run a hotel, and especially right now, it's not, the financials don't make a whole lot of sense. I got a room there for $700, I should say, which I felt like was a bargain. Yeah. I figured like I would stay there one night after I finished writing the book, so I did. I mean, it is what it is. It has this amazing history. It's like you read the book and so much, and you can feel all the characters kind of in the building. It's almost like a patina in the walls, but it's a lot like New York. I mean, Manhattan has been overtaken by a lot of foreign, investors, a lot of people who own properties here, apartments here that don't live there. It's the same thing at the Plaza. As it always is throughout history, it's really kind of illustrative of what's going on in New York, and a lot of times what's going on in America in terms of wealth and money and class.
So, I mean, every time I've passed it, which has been 50,000 times, I've wondered to myself, what's it like to stay there? And I never have. So what's it like to stay there?
Yeah, I mean, it's great, I mean, it's beautiful. Look, a lot of the gold that Donald Trump put in the 80s is still there. When I stayed there, I had, a swan faucet in my on the bathtub, and the room is elegant, and there's a butler who comes and brings you your breakfast or whatever. So it's definitely beautiful, but it's not, you can't get views facing the park. So you look onto 58th Street. So that's not quite as great. But it's, it's still the Plaza. It's still special. It's still New York. I would definitely suggest that, since now you're down in Tampa, when you come back and the Plaza opens, hopefully after, the coronavirus thing, ends hopefully soon, you should definitely stay there.
So. All right. Maybe my wife and I will,
exactly.
will splurge for the evening. I should also say you got married there. What's it like to get married at the Plaza? And is that why you wrote the book?
Right. So I mean, you didn't ask me why I wrote it, but I'll say, like, I did grow up in the city. I moved to New York when I was 15, and I went to high school not so far from Central Park. So we used to hang out there after school a lot, and I always saw the Plaza. And my grandmother lived in Pennsylvania, but she would always come and visit, and we would, as you mentioned, I think earlier, we would go to FAO Schwartz, look at all the amazing stuffed animals that were there, and occasionally have tea at the Palm Court. So it was always had these very special memories. And And then in 2009, when I got engaged, I guess I always hoped to get married there. It just was such a special place. So I was very lucky, and I was married in the terrace room, which was awesome. And, I also covered it as a reporter when it was made into condos. I worked for a daily paper in the city, and, I was one of the people who spent, days and days there writing about, what was going on with the union and the conversion into condominiums. So it just feels like it's, it's a part of New York. It's a part of the New York story. So
Julie Satow, author of The Plaza, The Secret Life of America's Most Famous Hotel. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Evan.
Well, certainly check out that book and also her Twitter account, which is @JulieSatow. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Be sure to check us out on Twitter and Instagram @AxelBankHistory. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.